Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Isentia Conversations webinar for today, which is focusing on communicating through change. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. We are going to spend the next half an hour breaking down what is going on in the world. It's been a month since we ran one of these sessions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists today. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. We have muted your microphones today, so we are definitely so excited to hear your thoughts, hear your questions, but we have muted you just so that we hopefully avoid any feedback coming through. But that definitely doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We've got around 15 minutes today just dedicated to questions. I've been reading up on some of the research work Shirish has been doing, so I've got some questions, but we really encourage you to leave some questions as well. And the best place to do that is in the chat area, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, you can just leave a note in the chat as well. We've got some folks from Isentia on hand to give you a hand, really. That's what we're doing. All right, so let's get started. And let me introduce you to the faces that you're hearing from in this session. So we have got a fruit salad of time zones in this session with us today. We have got Shirish Kulkarni, who is joining us from Cardiff. So I have to say a little bit of a good morning to you, Shirish. Thank you for being up nice and early to come along and discuss effective storytelling with our audience. So for those of you who are maybe wondering a little bit about what we'll be talking about today, we are focusing on effective storytelling. And Shirish is an award-winning journalist with over 25 years of experience, including experience in pretty much all of the broadcast newsrooms in the UK. But for the last year, what Shirish has been doing has been researching innovative ways to tell news stories and ways to frame that news information and make sure that that really resonates with an audience and finding out what it is that people actually want. So we're going to hear a little bit about that today, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into it. We've also got Ngaire Crawford with us today, and we have to say a good evening to Ngaire because Ngaire is joining us from New Zealand. So thank you, Ngaire, for being with us today. And Ngaire is the Head of Insights for Australia and New Zealand at Isentia. And so that means that Ngaire runs our media research division, and she's also the chair of the Global Young Leaders Group for AMEC, so the International Association for the Measurement and Education of Communication. So we're going to hand over to Ngaire first today. We've got lots to talk about, so we should really get stuck into it. And what Ngaire's been doing for the past couple of months while we've been running this webinar series is talking about the trends that we're seeing in the media and sharing some of her tips from the work that she's done in the communication space. So good evening, Ngaire. How are you and what have you been seeing over the last month? What's going on?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Yeah, it's been a very interesting month media-wise. Mostly is that we thought everything was getting back to normal, and unfortunately it is not. So very much the mainstream media is talking about we're back to that wall-to-wall COVID coverage. We're back to the very regular cadence of updates. And we now have a new breed of people to be Googling and be interested in the anti-maskers. And the unfortunate spokesperson of Bunnings, Karen. So that's become a really significant news story. So actually Bunnings Karen as a phrase has now it's close to 6,000 media items that mention Bunnings Karen. The other thing that we've noticed is that there's a slight increase in that focus on global coverage. So especially for Australia, it's understandable that there is an interest in that global context of second waves. Just to kind of contextualize what that positioning is like. The last time we had one of these sessions, I was talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of discussions around racial inequality. All of those things have very much taken a back seat to all of this COVID coverage sort of across the world. And then from a New Zealand perspective, where COVID isn't quite the main focus, that is very much returned to some very interesting election and electioneering coverage. For social media, earlier in the series, we spoke a lot about mental health and well-being and anxiety. One of the ways that this is manifesting itself at the moment is in a very strong sense of divisiveness. So this is people openly calling out misinformation, but it's also the place where you can perpetuate misinformation. And there's a huge sense of division between those people that are doing the right thing and those that aren't. Earlier in the pandemic, that was more focused on individual organisations and calling out companies and calling out brands. The nature of how everybody's feeling at the moment, this has much more turned into an individual call out. So that will be, for the case of New Zealand, that's people escaping their quarantine facilities. In Australia, it's the anti-maskers, or it'll be people that seem to be taking the wrong individual actions and putting everybody else at risk. In terms of the Google trends, again, Bunnings Karen has one of the rising trends at the moment, and also a lot of TV shows and kind of celebrity content. So Kanye West, things like that, because the nature of everyone's back to being a bit more restricted and locked down, or focusing on what it is that they're doing. So there's a lot of distraction and escapist searching going on. If you want to
I feel like whenever you say Bunnings Karen, Shirish, because he's based in Cardiff, just looks so completely blank about this cultural moment that we're having in Australia.
Yes,
Bunnings
it's a delightful thing to
home
Google.
improvement store, and it's a woman who refused to wear a mask there. So that's a little bit of context. I'll jump onto your next slide now, Ngaire.
So one of the things that I wanted to do is that in this context of having a discussion about storytelling, for anyone that's been in any of these webinars or have heard me speak before, I care a lot about making sure that you understand the context in which you're communicating. So that's why we round up these media trends, and then I talk a little bit about things I think you should consider as communications professionals right now, and things like key narratives that you should keep an eye on. So one of these things, and it is related to old Bunnings Karen, is the impact of video. So divisiveness particularly is based very much on this kind of receipts or evidence-based culture, and video is absolutely the easiest way for those messages to spread really quickly and for media to very easily lift the story. So it is very much something to consider from a risk perspective if you haven't already. So in your media and customer service training, when people are in a heightened emotional state, it is very quick to whip out video. Sometimes that has really important and amazing results, but it is always something to consider. And also consider your content at the moment. Now may not be the media environment to introduce beautifully produced videos, although that really high-end video content, just make sure that you're timing that appropriately. Also, echo chambers are very much alive and well in pandemic land, really. But heightened emotional states, again, it means that audiences will seek out information that confirms information that they want to believe. So keep an eye on the misinformation that's really relevant to you and to your business. And the other thing that we can see in this anti-mask debate is we get into this really complex space of media as a moral high ground. So especially what is quite a visceral reaction from media to anti-mask movements, or Bunnings Karen particularly, but at the same time giving that issue oxygen is one of those sort of complicated spaces to look at the moment. And also that tends to misunderstand the context of those arguments. So one of those drivers for anti-maskers and things like that is the idea that this is all a great big government and media construct, and inviting someone onto a breakfast show essentially to make a point that you don't believe them and you want to discredit them, which I completely understand that motivation. It doesn't necessarily change those people's minds. So the narrative to watch at the moment is really around rules fatigue. People are getting very tired of being told what to do. It's an incredibly natural reaction to be tired of being told what to do. but it isn't something to be really mindful of when communicating right now, is that there is this very heightened emotional state, especially for people entering a second phase of lockdown. And there's a lot of public health information. There's a lot of rules. So if that's an argument or a narrative you're going to contribute to, just probably watch what you're doing in that space at the moment. So that's my little summary for this month, and I'll hand on to Shirish.
Thanks, Ngaire. Thanks, Ali. So yeah, I'm just going to give you guys a very quick introduction to the research I've been doing over the last year. And then obviously, as Ali says, we'll kind of open up to questions. So yeah, that research I've been doing has been focused on how we can better tell news stories. But I think the things I've discovered really apply across the communications industry, because we really are all storytellers of some kind. So I used to think that was a horrible, pretentious phrase. And even when I started doing this, I was like, oh, do I really want to call it that? But actually, the more I've been reading and the more I've been thinking about it, the more I think it's exactly the right way of looking at things. And that's because we're hardwired for stories at an anthropological and a neuroscientific level. Those stories help us orientate us in the world. They're a virtual reality simulator to help us practice real life, essentially. So when we were cave people, we told our cave children those stories to stop them going out when the mammoth was around. And that developed into fairy tales and stories about, you know, kind of monsters behind the sofas nowadays. So it's about orientation, and those stories are really important in that. So if we take those kind of traditional stories, essentially they start at the beginning with once upon a time, particularly with fairy stories, obviously. They tell a story and then they reach a conclusion, they get to the end. So largely, news stories do the exact opposite of that. We use what's called the inverted pyramid structure, where the kind of top line is the conclusion, and then as you read down, you get gradually less and less interesting or less and less important information. And I think it's very often the same in press releases or communications packs, because there's a lot of crossover between journalism and communications or PR or whatever. So the reason for that isn't based on any great analysis of how users understand the world or how we take in information or any kind of principles of pedagogy. It actually just goes back to the days of the Telegraph, the original newswire, because it was expensive and unreliable, so it made sense to put as much of that information, the important information, as possible at the beginning, just in case you lost the end of it. So we don't use a telegraph anymore, that's gone, but habits formed by that technology still persist and define journalism and communication. So it's kind of ludicrous, really. So the key thing I discovered, and I know this is true because we ended up testing different forms with around 1,300 people, is that users actually prefer stories that work in a straightforward, linear way, like our traditional stories. And they also pick up more information when they read those kinds of stories, because it just fits with how we're hardwired to navigate the world. And the other reason we've been failing as journalists, because I think we are failing, is that we completely ignored what users need from news. So I attempted to reverse that, or at least kind of open up that debate by outlining kind of 6 key principles which we should have at the forefront of our minds when we're doing journalism or telling our stories. So the first up in those is actually the content. Is it actually useful or relevant, and does it help us understand the world better? And it sounds weird to have to say that, but actually so much journalism doesn't even start with that. So a really good example of that actually is when we have, and I guess you have exactly the same, when the Chancellor outlines his budget for the year in the UK, all the content around that is you would be £150 a year better off as a result of the budget. Now, that's not journalism. That's actually a political statement which says that a low tax, small state economy is better per se. And that's not, well, it's not true. It's it's contested at best, but actually it's not even how we understand well-being anymore, or really ever. So we might think, well, I want more money spent on the health service, I want more money spent on education, I want to be less well off in terms of pounds, but I want to be better off in terms of my life. But actually, journalism isn't letting us have that conversation because it's what we've always done. Secondly, are we giving enough context? So news largely focuses on breaking or at least moving news, but that's really often to the detriment of context, analysis, or frankly, understanding. So we assume so much pre-existing knowledge, and we need to be more accessible to all our users. Thirdly, we need to remember that our users have agency. They're not just passive victims of the news. They can be part of creating solutions too, and they want to choose how to engage with the news. So Vox Pops are a classic example of how we treat users if they don't have agency. They're just victims of the news. It's just happening to them. We need to think, particularly around young people, I think we need to think hard about the tone we use to communicate, and this will be familiar to you guys. We still fall back too much on horrible kind of journalese language that's old-fashioned and formulaic. So I've watched news bulletins with groups of young people as part of my research, and frankly, it's embarrassing because when you're there looking in their eyes as they watch the kind of top 5 minutes of a news program, they just switch off instantly. And we can't ignore that. That's horrible. So we need to do something about that tone. Diversity, inclusion in our storytelling is absolutely crucial. So for me, it's not just about telling stories differently, it's about telling different stories. Stories that really reflect the richness of our societies. And if you're not prepared to do that, then you're in the wrong business and you'll be found out very soon. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. So it's important to get across that. And finally, as we discussed earlier, is the inverted pyramid structure really the best way of doing narrative? What are the alternatives? Is it linear narratives that start at the beginning and finish at the end? What other structures are there? Because what we're doing isn't working. So we've got nothing to lose by trying something different. So as I mentioned, based on those principles, I created a number of prototypes and I tested them with users. And when we compared those with the BBC News article that are based on, users overwhelmingly preferred our prototypes. They picked up more information in less time and they found them easier to navigate. So what that proves is there is a better way of telling stories. We just need to be prepared to think differently and really put users at the center of our thinking. So yeah, so that's hopefully a kind of pretty good introduction, but yeah, really interested to talk about kind of what comes out of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm interested in what you were saying around picking up more information. And it's, you know, we started doing this webinar series because of COVID. It's about communicating through change, and it is hard to escape from that COVID backdrop. When we started this series, we'd just gone into lockdown in Australia and New Zealand, and it feels like a time when people really need to get comprehensive and accurate information from the news that they are consuming. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on media coverage of COVID in general, and how you think that applies even more so, even less so with the research that you've been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think media clearly have an absolutely crucial role, because I think I'm quite naive and idealistic, even at nearly 50. But the only justification for having journalism is to provide reliable and useful information, because we know it's not there to make money, frankly. It's actually the only justification for journalism can be in public service. So what I've seen is actually pretty disappointing, if I'm honest, that we've stuck to those habits of, there's a big thing about kind of news being about entertainment. And so there's a focus on kind of the drama of news rather than the information of news. And I think that's a really confused approach. And I'm always very suspicious when I hear journalists talk about ratings, you know, oh, like our ratings are really great, because that's not, very often it's not about the journalism, it's just what's around it or what stories are going on. And I just think, look after doing the news well, and the viewing figures will look after themselves. So I get really suspicious of that, and I think we lose sight of doing the news well, and we go chasing ratings. So the answer, I think, is to think about what we need to know, because we're users as well. You know, the audience and us aren't different people. We're users as well. So when I made my prototypes, I just asked myself a series of questions about what I needed to know about the story, and I went about answering them and doing the research around that. And I think actually you do see that, and people often look down on this. So in the papers, in the kind of sort of ad model papers, you get a lot of, you know, which supermarkets are open in your area, or what time are they open, or what, and actually that's really useful information, and actually that will drive engagement with you. But actually I think we can go to the next more kind of sophisticated level and provide information. You know, we talked a bit about misinformation, I already talked about that, but actually we can do better on that. So I think it just gets back to, we have to treat journalism and communications like any other industry, and we're not a special case. We need to think about what users want, provide them with that, and do a good job, basically.
Richard has sent through a question which he says is somewhat ironic to request, but can you repeat those 6 principles headlines?
Yeah, sure. So they are. So actually, they're in. I've obviously given you some of the resources that you're going to send out after this, and they're in that. But yeah, so content, is the content we're producing actually useful and relevant, or is it just kind of habitual? Is it just a template for what news is that we're filling? Context. So Philip Pullman, who wrote Historic Materials, his book on storytelling is really interesting on this, because he talks about never using the present tense, because it just provides a vertical slice through a horizontal world, like looking through those kind of vertical blinds. He says he never uses the present tense. So are we providing that kind of longitudinal view of life? So we don't do that in journalism. We provide that slice through the day, and it's not enough. Agency, users have agency on both the input side, that they are not just victims of the news, but also they want to consume the news in a way that they get a choice in that. Tone, so yeah, pretty obviously, the tone we're using is pretty old-fashioned and formulaic. Diversity and inclusion, so telling stories differently, but also telling different stories. And narrative, yeah. What's the form of narrative we're using? Is it really just the best way of using, particularly is the inverted pyramid style the best way? I don't think it is.
Awesome. And for anybody who is looking for a copy of that, in the reminder email that I sent out personally today, if you click on Shirish's hyperlinked name, you'll go through to that, and you'll automatically get something from the system after this that will have both the recording and some resources as well. If you're having any trouble locating those things, just let me know and I'll send it through again. We've got a question coming through from Krish, who is an internal comms person. And this question is around doing a lot of work around creating context and communications, telling a story in a linear way rather than top down. Any tips on making this more effective, especially in face-to-face presentations and talking notes rather than emails?
Yeah, so I think, so the things that worked really well actually draw on kind of a lot of kind of fairly standard principles of pedagogy. So the thing that really worked was what we call the kind of narrative accordion prototype, where for a story we just had kind of 5 questions, and you had the questions which you could expand or collapse the answers to, which meant you could either read from the top down and you had a sort of a linear narrative that you could read as one story, or you could go to the question you were most interested in. So the story we did was around HS2, which some people may have heard of, which is just the kind of high-speed the proposed high-speed rail link, which would go from London to kind of Manchester and Leeds in the UK. And it's been really controversial. But the first question I asked, actually, and it goes back to what we're talking about context as well, is why is it called HS2? Because actually, when I asked journalists that, only about 10% of people know the answer. But actually, that never appears in any journalism because we just assume that everyone knows why it's called HS2. And the reason is because HS1 was the Channel Tunnel rail link. But starting from the beginning, why is it called this? What is it? But then we sort of asked, is this a green solution? Which was question 5. And some people will be automatically drawn to that because we habitually think of rail as a green solution. But in the case of HS2, it probably isn't. So, that's a really interesting question. And people with a particular interest in environmental stuff may go to that question first. But what we did was we chunked the information. And that's a really familiar term from pedagogy if you've got kind of teachers in your families or things like that. So actually, we just wrote that information in bullet points, essentially. So the other thing we discovered was that all the prototypes I wrote were half as long as the standard BBC News article. And that's a really good thing for presentations, because actually you end up, particularly for writing this inverted pyramid style, you end up having to include lots of what I call kind of interstitial writing to kind of make the links, to kind of make it make sense. And if you're writing in a linear style, you're not having to do that. And actually, it's some of that interstitial stuff, which is actually confusing readers and is working against the way our brains are hardwired to understand stories. So thinking in that kind of straightforward, I don't like Ngaire and Ali, I don't know if you'll agree on it, but actually a lot of communications is just about simplifying stuff and not, keeping it simple, stupid, basically, and actually not going into that kind of long form journalistic style that it's really easy to do because again, it's habitual. It's like we write essays in school or college or whatever. So I think it's kind of thinking, is this useful to my users? Can I just cut it and, just make it simple? So I think those would be my key points really from that.
Awesome. We've got time for another couple of questions. So if there is something you were interested in hearing from Shirish or Ngaire on, definitely drop that into the questions area. Something that I wanted to ask you, Shirish, was about communicating with young people.
Yeah.
One of a previous session that we ran was with Helen McMurdo from MTV, and it was really popular. People were looking for that silver bullet when it comes to communicating with youth audiences. And I've been reading your blog, getting ready for this session today, and I've got to say that I probably made the assumption that younger people have short attention spans, that paragraph at the beginning that contains all of the information probably works. Are you able to tell us a little bit more what you've learned and what you've been hearing?
Yeah, so this is my favorite question where people always ask me, because I think people get a characterization of young people and their needs completely wrong. And this comes from kind of the ether. We're told that young people only have attention spans of 2 minutes, and you can't make a story or a video that's longer than 2 minutes long because they won't take it in. They can't comprehend what that is. So I never think of young people as a different species. That's weird because we're all young people. We don't kind of pupate at 25 and come out as an entirely different creature. We're the same people, we're just older. So in my research, I didn't think of young people as an entirely different constituency. I just think of them as kind of the adults of the future, kind of the market of the future, if you want to be vulgar about it. So in that spirit, I think the whole attention spanning is absolute nonsense. So my background is TV news. We're constantly told you can't make anything longer than 2 minutes because young people won't watch it. So wait till those guys hear about Game of Thrones or Grand Theft Auto or The Sopranos or The Wire, their minds are going to be completely blown, because people, the truth is, and I highly recommend the book, so it's in the resources actually, called Everything Bad is Good for Us, which talks about how this generation is the most emotionally and culturally intelligent generation we've ever had. So even so-called trash TV, like Big Brother and the Kardashians, is about really complicated understandings of human relationships and emotional causality. So all the evidence from TV, films, games, whatever, is that young people aren't put off by complexity or depth. They are actively craving it. So for heaven's sake, don't talk down to them or underestimate them. They're way ahead of the game. And that's why they're not into the stuff we're making right now. They want and deserve better. So that's been my really key message from that.
Awesome. We've got another couple of questions coming through, so I'll ask those as well. And Kate has asked if it's useful to use the inverted pyramid style when pitching to journalists, or is the more linear storytelling style just as useful there? What are your thoughts on that one?
So yeah, it's an interesting one. So I think if it's the best method of communication for you, yeah, pitch using that kind of linear storytelling. I think in terms of pitching to journalists, what I'd also say is, again, think about what the end user needs. Like if you can tell a journalist, yeah, this information is going to be really useful to the end user, your reader or viewer, then I think kind of their ears should prick up. I mean, I think it's a problem that in a way the journalism industry isn't kind of mature enough yet, but we still are doing things in these habitual ways. But yeah, I think, I mean, the kind of the title of this is Communicating Through Change. And I think it's about being open to change and thinking, actually, in all industries, we've got to, this is a really good time to reassess, is what we're doing actually doing what we want it to do? Or is what we're doing just what we've always done? And I think if you think, yeah, if you look at it and think, oh yeah, telling this in a linear way, a straightforward way, which has all those things like context and is in the right tone and really helps us understand the story. But I think, yeah, absolutely. I don't think people will necessarily be put off by, yeah, that kind of not using the inverted pyramid. I think headlines are a really important thing in this as well, because it's like I watch the news and like headlines give away the whole story. And that's not what headlines are for. And again, on TV, we use newspaper styles of headlines. Like why? It's a completely different medium. So again, actually, is your headline a tease, or is it designed to give all the information in that kind of 2 lines? Because if it is, then don't be surprised if they don't read any of the rest of it. So it's kind of, you know, thinking, what is this trying to achieve? Because if it is a headline which gives away the whole story, then people won't read. Why should they read the rest of it? So actually, it's finding that balance between giving useful information, but actually kind of giving the incentive to read more as well.
Probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions. And on that idea of change, Josie has asked if you've come up against traditional journalists, of which you are one, and how you bring around those folks to this kind of new approach.
Yeah, so I mean, that's why it's really important in the research to actually make some things and test them, because it's all very well having big ideas, but yeah, having cold, hard facts is what drives the engagement with this sort of stuff. So so all the prototypes were better than what's currently out there, according to users. And in the best prototype, so around 83% of people found the prototype more convenient, 80% of people found it more engaging, and 75% of people said it helped them understand the story better. So I get, like, Josie's question is coming from, yeah, a really sensible place, because actually I'm still a bit kind of worried that newsrooms will kind of ignore that. But I do kind of think if you're prepared to turn down a simple change of mindset, which will help 75% of users understand the story better, then there is no helping you, frankly. So yeah, I can present them with the evidence. They can decide whether to take it on or not. But I think the problem with journalism is there's lots of whinging on about, oh, we're in a crisis, no one's reading. But are people prepared to do anything about it? I don't actually see a lot of that. So, you've got to make a choice. Do you want to just whinge on about it and lose your job in 5 years' time because no one's willing to pay for the thing? Or actually, do you want to make the change? And I think we have to be prepared to make the change.
Danielle has asked for a little bit more information about what it is that people preferred, asking, what were the tweaks that you made to the order of content, layout, or other tweaks that you could share? And I'd probably point you to, Danielle, the resources. If you click Shirish's name that I sent around in an email earlier, you'll be able to get to a little guidebook that Shirish has sent through, and that will be sent through after the webinar today. And that also has contact details for Shirish too. So if there's not quite what you're looking for in there, then feel free just to get in touch. Yeah, Chris has said that they'd love to see some examples as well. But
yeah.
in the last couple of minutes today, are you able to expand a little bit on some of those tweaks or practical changes that some of the storytellers in our session today could take?
Yeah, so I think I've described a little bit about what that kind of narrative accordion thing looked like. On the kind of context style, we looked a bit at timelines as well. And so, because we were talking about HS2, we actually went back a long way. So we went back to 1960 when Japan introduced high-speed rail, for example, because part of the story is it's 2020. Why are we so terrible at high-speed rail? It's not like some new invention. And interestingly, we also looked forward. So we looked forward to 2050 and like what's going to happen in the future. So some people would regard that as not news. But I think it's really important to say to people, well, actually, even if HS2 happens, it won't be finished till 2040 at the earliest. And actually, if you live in the north of England where rail services, you can't get on a train now, do you want to spend, billions of pounds on that now when you could, for less money, have a train you could get on now, not in 20 years' time? So I think there's interesting things around context, because again, we have that focus. I think a really crucial thing is to not focus on the day news, to be able to give users that wider context to help them understand the story better. Really interestingly, and this is something I think to try as well, one of the prototypes people really loved was this horrible thing I made, which was actually just a kind of plain text format, which I tried to build in the structure of a 3-act kind of play structure. So I didn't write as a play, I wrote it just as kind of linear text, but actually to kind of have that kind of sense of jeopardy at the beginning, and then you had a hero where like the train track was the hero, and then you had a resolution at the end, and it was horrible. I hated it. People absolutely loved it. And I think that's largely because just people preferred the linear style. So even though it was horrible, they loved the linear structure. So I think I want to kind of do a bit more work on that and actually see, is it just the linear style or the kind of the weird kind of 3-act play structure? But actually, again, because it might be that structure, because essentially we're hardwired to those stories from the Aeneid or the Iliad or whatever. Those are the structures that have been used. So actually, those are kind of deeply ingrained at a visceral level. So that might be it. But there's interesting things, I think, to kind of learn from all of those.
Awesome. I'm just looking at at our questions, and we've got one coming through from Patricia, which I think will be our last question or our last comment today. From a comms perspective in Australia, there's a big divide between commercial media and government-funded media, particularly commercial digital versions of online news sites, and it can be hard to get a run unless we have clickability of a story. Might not be sexy or quirky enough for commercial media. Updates to headline regularly happen to get the click rates up, and so surely that impacts the storytelling and the integrity of a piece. For a last comment, is there anything that you'd add there, Shirish or Ngaire, on that one?
Ngaire?
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point, especially when we are living in quite paywalled online environments, and those metrics of clickbait are quite prevalent, but also potentially inherently flawed too. So that, I think there's probably in that more systemic change that's needed. So that there'd have to be part of this kind of really interesting research is obviously how do you apply that to a commercial model, and what if you know that the user experience is better, how do you demonstrate that into that commercial environment? So I think there's obviously another layer of change that would be outside the individual story.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd add to that in the kind of wider perspective. I think where journalism's really messing up is this kind of search for, is going back to the kind of idea of entertainment, this kind of fetishization of opinion in news. So, you know, trust is the biggest issue facing news right now. So there's a recent Reuters digital news report which showed that 39% of people don't even trust the news that they use. And that's kind of horrendous. And the answer to that isn't by, you know, having much more opinion. Like we have like an opinion show on Sky News here, and I know Sky News is kind of has more of that in Australia, but you know, or kind of searching for Twitter celebrity for your journalists. Like that way does not lie the solution to the problem of trust. The solution lies in kind of a retrenchment to fact-based journalism. You don't kind of solve the problem of trust by having more opinion, and that's just kind of nonsense, and it's the thing that frustrates me the most about what's happening now. And I think people really have to get a grip on that, because it's very short-termist, and we will kill the industry like that.
I think that's probably all that we've got time for. We've run a little bit over, but I just wanted to thank everybody for coming along today. We really appreciate your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation. In the email that you'll get from the system about an hour after this wraps up, so in about an hour's time, we'll automatically send you through the recording in case there were any bits that you want to visit. And that email will have some resources from Shirish as well, talking around those different ways of telling stories and being able to see some of those examples. I'll also pop a link in that email that I send around to the Comms Agenda 2021, which is something that Isentia and IABC APAC are excited to launch today. And so you'll be able to click to download that report, and in that report you'll be able to have a look at some research that we've been doing. It's a very researchy webinar today to uncover insights around what the future of the comms profession looks like right across APAC, and what the top priorities are for comms professionals like yourselves over the next 12 months. But that's all we've got time for today. We'll run another one of these sessions in August, so we'll be in touch with invites there. I can't believe we're talking about August already, but thank you everybody. Shirish, have a wonderful day. Everybody else have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you later.